Welcome to the Practice Discipleship Initiative webinar series. My name is Dawn Troutman, and I am your host throughout this series. You may know me from LutheranLifeCoach.com and also the Extravaganza, which is an ELCA Children's and Youth Ministry event, and we'll talk more about that at the end if that is new for you. This initiative is a dynamic partnership between the ELCA Youth Ministry Network, the ELCA and its youth gathering, and ELCA seminaries and colleges. Practice Discipleship offers leadership development for the sake of faith formation, and this year's theme is Frame. There are a series of 6 webinars that we are in the 5th of those. You see them listed there on your screen. They all focus on Lutheran theology, ministry theory, and practical skills relating to our theme of Frame. Today's webinar is titled Framing the Vision, Seeing New Things. Our presenter today is Dr. Mindy Maycant. She is the Assistant Professor of Religion at Lenoir-Rhyne University. Before we jump into her presentation, I do want you to take note of the box on the right side of your screen. That's where you can ask questions and make comments as we go along. So please do ask questions and be sure and jump in, and I will relay those questions to Mindy at any point throughout the presentation. We'll get to as many questions and comments as possible. So welcome, Mindy.
Thank you, Dawn. Hi, it's nice to be here.
Yes, I'm glad, and I'm very excited about this topic. So let's jump in.
All right, thank you. So what we're looking at today is framing the vision, thinking of ways to help give a telos, a direction, a framework to the way you see and do ministry. The Proverbs quote that you see on the screen in front of you, where there is no vision, the people will perish. This sounds great, but the problem that we often have in ministry is figuring out exactly what that vision is, first of all, and then trying to figure out how to get buy-in from the people that you're trying to serve, from your youth, from your pastoral leadership, from your parents, from your community. And so what I'm trying to do in this session is to help introduce ways to help you take some concrete steps, to give you some particular tools to help guide you, your congregation, your youth ministry program, through a process that helps discern what ministry with children, youth, and families might look like.
Wonderful. Yay. This seems to be such a gap in the church, so let's do this. I'm excited.
All right, well, thank you. So the first thing I want to do is to ask the listeners out there to think for a moment about, in your own current ministry setting, what is it that you do that you're most proud of? What sorts of ministries do you do that you feel are the most faithful, effective ministry activities? And what I really want to ask people to focus on is the content of what you do. What is it that you do? Not a focus on what gets the most people there. I'm not so much concerned with numbers as with faithfulness.
I love it. And this is a place, if you are listening live, you can go to the right side of your screen and type it into the chat box, and I will bring those up. One answer is just an overall, not so much about a program or something you do, but Paul Amlin here at the National Church Office, where I'm broadcasting from, talked about he's kind of proud of how inclusive it is. And then Rod said one thing he does that is meaningful is listen to high school youth. Lisa said creating space for adults and youth to have meaningful conversations. And please do keep those answers coming. Allison said authentic relationships. Awesome. And maybe jump back in or react to any of those, Mindy, and if there are more, I will jump in with those a little bit later.
I think those are all awesome. That's exactly what I'm looking for. Ways that we engage. I can't remember, I didn't keep track of the names you were saying as you're reading them, but the engaging people in relational ministry. My first thought when I think of this question is I'm a member of a very small parish and small congregation, and in part because of the small size of our church, our youth are much more involved in active worship leadership. I have a 9-year-old who helps me on altar guilt every time that I'm up to do it, and who helps with cleaning up after communion and just all of the things like that where we engage people both within and outside of the congregation. is really part of what I was trying to look at and have people think about. A lot of what we do that perhaps is most important and most formational are the little things, not the huge programmatic things, but the little everyday things that get wrapped into the way we live our lives as a community together.
Wonderful. And Sam wrote something that works well with that. He just wrote laugh. That's what he does
Absolutely.
in ministry.
Right.
Yeah, and then Susan wrote creating a space where children and youth feel a sense of belonging. So thank you all for your answers. Go ahead,
Right.
Mindy.
Those are great. Thank you. And so part of what I want to, I want to look at 4 different models for ways that we might think about ministry. And these models are not hard and fast categories. There's nothing about this that is particularly magical. They're just ways of thinking about the goal of the way we're thinking about doing ministry. And each of these models is focused really on a particular preposition. So maybe this says more about my own grammatical way of thinking through things than anything else, but it helps me to think in terms of prepositions. So I want to just speak very briefly about 4 different potential models, ways we might think about how we do ministry. And the first is that of advocacy. I mean, this is something everybody's familiar with. Advocacy is a ministry that focuses on standing up for, so for being the preposition there, or on behalf of others. Mm-hmm. You know, it's the things that we do for someone else. Usually when we think of doing something for someone, it's because they're someone, particularly vulnerable situation where they may not be able to do it for themselves. So one example of that being working as a guardian ad litem, speaking on behalf of children who are going through various court cases, typically in situations of child abuse. So that's one way of thinking of ministry is, you know, what do we do for somebody else? I'm just going to run through all 3 of these 4 first, and then we can look at them kind of together. Then another way of thinking about it is a ministry of care, right? So that's a ministry which focuses on providing care to somebody else. So not so much a for, but a to. It's not standing up in their stead, but serving them in a very particular way, doing ministry to them. And there's something almost inert about that on the part of the one receiving the ministry, right? They're receiving it, and then the church is, or the ministry itself is the more active party. So you think of perhaps like after-school care or tutoring programs, also health clinics, free health care, things of that nature that churches might sponsor, meals for the homeless where you're providing care to another party. That's another way of framing it. So you can think of advocacy or you can think of care. And then a third category is one of companionship. And that's a ministry where your focal preposition is with. So it's a ministry that focuses on being with others. So one of the listeners saying before about relational ministry, that would be what this is. You know, you're working alongside with someone, and the focus of the ministry becomes on the withness, which isn't really a word, but we'll pretend. And so that becomes the focus, right? It's not on what we're doing to someone, but our withness with them. And so one example of that would be like the Big Brothers, Big Sisters organization, which maybe not in the church, but a lot of churches may partner with Big Brothers or Big Sisters, sort of a thing. And then the 4th model is one of equipping, which is a ministry that focuses on helping develop the skills of the other. And so there the focus on the ofness, right? That the other, that you're in a position where you're helping, your ministry becomes an enabling of the ministry of the other. So one of the examples for this is the YAGM program, right? The Youth, Young Adults in Global Mission that the ELCA does, which actually the Young Adults in Global Mission very much has a withness component to it. Part of the ministry itself is the walking with. But how we train our young people to go be with is a way of equipping. The ELCA is actively working to equip young people to go out then and do ministry. And so that's just the 4 kind of a way of framing it in 4 categories. And I'll pause there and make sure there aren't, or ask if there are any questions that anybody has about those categories before.
They're great, and if you do have questions, please write them into the box. While we're waiting to see if there's questions, I do have one more place where someone is really proud of how what's happening in ministry. Pastor Tricia Lowe wrote she creates opportunities for people to share their faith stories and had a Lenten series where folks shared their stories in small groups, wrote spiritual autobiographies. So if we want to use that as an example, which of these 4 categories would you say that fits into, Mindy?
Well, that's a good question because it could be more than one, right? I mean,
I love that.
There's a companionship aspect to it. You're very much working with people, walking alongside them to think about where their spiritual autobiography is. But then there's also very much an equipping that comes from that, equipping someone to first of all even just think, to be reflective about their own spiritual journey, and then how that equips them for ministry. So I think that might be in more than one category. And I think that's often the case, right? That what we do may not just be one of these 4. And that's fine. Those are just ways of thinking through what we're doing. And part of what I want to say is that all 4 of these are actually necessary, right? I'm not trying to suggest that we need to like only focus on doing ministry in one or the other, but rather to be reflective about what we're doing. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I love that. And then that feeds well into Lisa's question. She's asking, are these 4 areas a developmental process, like a growth process of ministries where advocacy is early and equipping is the most developed? Or how would you sort of put these out there?
That's a great question. And I think that there's a yes. My students can't stand it. This is the way I answer questions, but I'm going to do it anyway. There's a yes-no quality to the answer. I mean, I think that yes, there is a developmental process. And if you don't mind moving on to the next slide, please, that would be great.
Yeah.
Part of what I'm trying to suggest is that all 4 are absolutely necessary, but that over the course of kind of the span of a ministry period, there is a trajectory. We do want to be moving towards equipping. And it's not a straight line development, which the way I've got it written on the slide, drawn on the slide, makes it sort of look like it could just be a straight line, like we move directly from 4 to 2 to with to of. And I'm not sure that it's quite that linear, because there'll be different people with different needs within any given community at any given time. And so I think a large part of what you're working on and trying to get a vision for the ministry is discerning where the community has the greatest need right now, and recognizing that within any given community there will be people for whom advocacy is what is most needed. And yet there will be people for whom equipping is what's most needed. And those people can be the same people. The same child that might need, say youth particularly, well, even a much younger child, the same child or youth who may still need an adult advocate in one aspect of their life is also already a beloved child of God who is ready to be equipped to go out and do real ministry. And so though there is a developmental sort of trajectory, it's not a straight, clear line where you crawl and then you walk and then you run. You know, it's more of a looping back always as we continue to grow forward together as a community of faith.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And Lisa, if you do have follow-up questions, we're happy to entertain them. But for now, let's go on.
All right, thank you. So again, if we can move on to the next slide then. And there you see my little arrow. So sure you're kind of moving, but not necessarily straightforward. Okay, part of my focus in thinking about this is recognizing that a lot of what's done in the church today focuses, particularly with ministry towards for or of children and youth. A lot of our larger social focus has been on keeping children and youth in the church. And I understand that, but what it amounts to is that much of the conversation then disintegrates into heated arguments over how we're going to keep our kids from leaving the church. How are we going to keep young people, once they're confirmed in the church in particular, rather than leaving? And what it seems to me happens is that we have an almost daily pendulum swing from this battle cry that we should be entertaining our kids because that's what they want. See, that's the carrot, right? So we're entertaining our kids to keep them coming. Or, maybe we have, what we need is just back to the basics, focus on discipline and catechetical formation. And so we have this kind of tug of war between parties within the church and maybe even within ourselves of whether or not what we really need to do is entice our children back into the church, entice our youth to be involved with us, or is it a matter of force? Do we need to be more disciplined and require it and have stricter guidelines for what confirmation looks like and what discipleship looks like? And so these often become just really utilitarian debates over pragmatism, which works better. And congregations are often swayed more by sheer numbers than necessarily by thinking through the theology behind it and what using either a system of rewards or a system of discipline and punishment, what those really say about both the nature of a child, of people, of humanity, so that there's kind of a lack of theological anthropology, as well as a lack of a notion of the what's the purpose for being involved in the church in the first place. And so this ongoing debate, it seems to assume that everybody involved assumes that the presence of children, youth, and families in the life of the congregation is good. I mean, that seems to be the understood, we all seem to get that. But what doesn't seem to often be thought about, or talked about anyway, is why. Why is it we need children and youth to be active members of the congregation? And it seems ironic to me, particularly in a community of faith where we do, in fact, practice infant baptism, that this argument is often predicated on this claim that children or youth are the church of the future, or they're the future of the church, whichever way you want to phrase that.
Instead of the present.
Right, and that's exactly, and that tends to completely forget that children and youth are always already an integral part of the community they belong to. I mean, just like they're part of our families, they're part of our church. And I mean, this is true in any congregation and any community of faith, but particularly in a Lutheran context where
I was going to say, do you know the article, Dear Parents of Young Children in Church?
Yes.
It was floating around, and maybe you're aware of it. Jamie Breezehoff, a Lutheran, wrote it, and it was picked up by the Huffington Post, but she was saying they're not to be endured. Their voices and their presence are an actual part that's very important, and we are not a congregation if we don't have them here.
Exactly, that's absolutely right. And that's precisely that, because they're a part of our family, they're a part of our community, they're a part of who we are. We don't have to do anything to make them be a part of the body. What we need to do instead is to rightly recognize and receive them as the very valued members of the community that they actually already are. I mean, by virtue of their baptism, by virtue of their birth into our communities, but particularly as a baptismal claim.
And if I can, Lisa quoted Bishop Eaton here in the chat, so I feel like I need to give a shout out there.
Yeah.
That Bishop Eaton said, and she's paraphrasing, of course, but it was something like, youth aren't replacement parts for the church. Thank
Absolutely.
you, Lisa.
That's
and
wonderful.
Bishop Eaton.
Right. That's a very good quote. Actually, I'm taking just a moment to scratch that down.
I love it. It's really good.
I have a little notepad. I have to write that down very quickly. I appreciate that. That's exactly right. They're not here just to replace us when we die off. They're a part of who we are today. And so part of this gets a little bit more philosophical for a second, but there's a wonderful British philosopher, Iris Murdoch, who is also a novelist. But Murdoch, one of the things that she says, she is also an ethicist, is that by way of thinking in terms of ethical thought, that the only way that we act in a world is that we act in the world that we see, right? So that my actions whatever they are, they reflect the way that I see the world. Right? It's not necessarily the way the world actually is. It's the way I see the world. And so everything I do reflects my vision of how the world is. And this isn't just, though Murdoch's just speaking about individuals, this isn't just true about individuals, it's true about communities. And so when a congregation is a community, it's its own entity. And so it's also not, because it's its own entity, because it's connected to the body of Christ. But when a congregation acts, it's acting in the world that it collectively sees. So not just my vision, but our vision. And that means that how we learn to see really matters. So how we frame the world that we see determines the way we do ministry. How we see children determines how we do ministry with children. If I see children as problems to be managed or as replacement parts, then that's going to shape how I engage the children in my life. But
and just a quick jump in, since you said it, a couple of people wanted us to repeat the quote from Bishop Eaton, and please know we're paraphrasing. Bishop Eaton didn't write this in the chat. Someone else heard her say it. So youth aren't replacement parts for the church. That's the quote for those of you asking in the chat. Youth aren't replacement parts for the church.
Which is,
thank you.
That's a wonderful quote. I am so appreciative of the listener who added that. That's wonderful. And so part of what this means then, if it's true, and I really do think it is, that the world I act in is determined by the way I see the world, then one of the most important things we can do in ministry is to focus on having a right vision, on learning to see the world rightly. But that necessarily raises a question about what that means. What exactly is right vision? And so in particular, I'm thinking right now of focusing on children and youth in the church. And there have been a number of very good books written in the past few years on why the church is shrinking numerically. And this isn't just an ELCA issue, it's an across-the-board issue, particularly why youth and young adults are leaving the church in what appears to be fairly large and significant numbers. And there is a tremendous temptation as a result of the research, and it's good research that's been done, to develop ministry plans that act as something of a tourniquet, that are intended to stop the flow, of children and young adults that are leaving. And most of it's the Barna Group who's done the research, and most of the Barna Group research has suggested that a lot of the reason that our youth are leaving the church is because they find it to be, and these aren't my words, this is from the Barna Group, irrelevant, exclusive, and shallow. Now, I'm not in any way trying to diminish the work of the Barna Group. I think the work they've done is great. I suspect they're right that those three problems that our youth do mention as being reasons that they're not engaged by the church. But at the same time, part of what I want to suggest is that focal point is in and of itself a wrong vision. That if what we're focusing on is stopping our youth from leaving, then what we're worrying about is retaining a status quo church. It's a matter of keeping kids from leaving, and that's not the right vision. I mean, that to me seems to have come a long way from the early church, from a living, active, breathing gospel. And so I want to look just for a second to think about for a second. In the book of Acts, Paul and Silas are called out and are accused of turning the world upside down. Right? This is the accusation that's made against them. They have turned the world upside down. And how they've turned the world upside down is through their proclamation of the gospel. If we could go to the next slide, please, Chris. You get my lovely picture of the globe turned upside down.
Oh, the world upside down.
Turned upside down. But the way Paul and Silas have turned it upside down is because of their proclamation that Jesus is Lord. Right? There's not, and that's all about how they see the world. Right? So there's this flipping upside down of that claim. This claim that Jesus is Lord has taken everything that the people in the early church, the world around them, the Greco-Roman world, thought to be true, and it's turned it upside down on its axis. That's a vision for ministry. right? Not keeping kids from leaving because they get bored, but turning the world upside down. A Christian faith, a vision of ministry that that turns the world upside down would never have bored kids. You know, we would never have kids that, if we're really about doing a ministry that flips the world upside down through our proclamation that Jesus is Lord, and therefore I don't have to be in control. Therefore, all of these other things don't take precedent. We don't have kids that are bored and thinking that the church is irrelevant. And so I think that this focus on keeping our children and youth in just gets it backwards. It may look like it's the right way. It might look right side up because it's the practical utilitarian way of thinking about things that we're used to in our culture. It's a matter of numbers and efficiency and data, and that looks right to us. But when we look at the world through that lens of numbers and efficiencies, it sees the world through a lens that forgets that Jesus is Lord. It's a way of giving into the myth of scarcity. It's a fear that what God has given us is not enough. It's not recognizing the gift in the children and the youth that we do have, and it invites us. It lures us really into believing that children, youth, family, our people, our members of our congregation are a scarce resource, and that we have to somehow or another compete with other communities, and that may be other churches, it's sport teams, it's work, it's school, it's entertainment industry, you know, all of these communities that we feel we must compete with just in order to survive in this kind of hostile consumer market. But the problem is that's not consistent with the message of the gospel. In fact, the gospel consistently turns that logic upside down. God has indeed given the church all of the gifts that we need to be the church. So I want just to read for a second. In our baptismal liturgy, we hear of the gifts that are given from the Holy Spirit in baptism. And these are gifts that are promises that are given to all of the baptized, not a select few, but to all of the baptized. The spirit of wisdom and understanding, the spirit of counsel and might, the spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord, the spirit of joy and God's presence both now and forever. Those are promises that we've been given. That's more than enough. So we don't have to have, I mean, that's the upside down, right? That's the world flipped upside down. Children and youth aren't this scarce resource that we need to compete for. They are recipients of these baptismal gifts of the Spirit. And that's a completely different way of thinking about our youth. And so what we're charged with as adults, as those who are thinking about how to frame ministry in our settings, is with being faithful stewards of these gifts. Not just of the people, but of the gifts. And not trying to get more, to see how many more warm bodies we can have, but rather to see, to have the vision to see these gifts that are right before us every day, and then to have kind of the theological imagination to know what to do with them. And this is a new way of seeing the world for most of us. It's a way of seeing the world that feels very upside down because it's unstable, it's uncertain, it's not counting on numbers, it's counting on the it's relying on the Holy Spirit rather than on ourselves. And so part of the visioning becomes focusing on how the church becomes a place where we all, whether children, youth, young adults, older adults, where we all continue to be formed into a people, individually and collectively, who continue to grow in faith towards God and in fervent love towards one another, right? I mean, something we hear in our liturgy all the time, that we're going to grow in faith towards God and in fervent love towards one another. And if we do this, if that's where our focus is on how we grow in faith and grow in love, the church will become a place where children or youth are likely to stay. But that's grace, and it's a side effect. It's not that, in other words, when we focus on keeping children and youth, then we lose the vision of actually doing Spirit-filled, Spirit-led ministry. But when we can keep our vision, we can keep the frame, we can keep the lens on that helps us to focus on becoming a people who take these baptismal promises seriously and live into them, then having active, thriving children's and youth ministry become a side effect of that, not the goal. And so there's a sense in which by focusing on the goal of numbers, we actually probably lose people. And if we let go of the goal of numbers and focus on faithfulness, then the numbers that we have will be more than sufficient.
So Rod asks, what do you think motivates the thinking of trying not to lose youth? Do you think it's fear? Do you think it's tradition? What's behind the numbers?
I think it's both fear and tradition. I think it probably is mostly fear. Fear of the unknown, maybe, as much as of tradition. Not fear of tradition, I don't mean that, but yeah. that there's a fear of the unknown, and therefore we rely on the tradition. So to think of it in a different way, people of, say, my parents' generation, I'm 45, so in my parents' generation, everybody, I can't imagine my mom having grown up knowing anyone who didn't go to church. I mean, I'm from South Carolina, so every Sunday, every Wednesday, right? When I was a child, we still had blue laws in South Carolina, and so you couldn't do anything else on Sundays because there was nothing else open. Everybody went to church. There were no exceptions to that. And so I think part of the fear is simply because we don't know another way. And particularly
fear of change, right?
Fear of change and of not knowing. If my children aren't growing up in the church, how do I know that they're getting what they need? How do I know what they're becoming? How do we know what's going to happen? So yeah, I think it is a fear of the unknown and a reliance on tradition. And I actually think that a reliance on tradition can be really helpful and good. So I don't at all mean that that's a problem. But I think that when our focus is on the fear of losing children rather than on the joy of helping children grow into spirit-filled youth, young adults, we lose a lot, actually. We stand to lose more than we stand to gain, because then our ministry becomes fear-based rather than based in a gratitude for what we do have and a recognition of what we do have. And honestly, that sort of fear is probably an idolatrous sort of sin. I haven't really thought about it that way, but it's probably a form of idolatry. It's a reliance on our own resources and strength and knowledge rather than a reliance on the Lord.
So what would you say to someone like your parents? You know, that this fear is founded out of faithfulness, wanting, to, their goal is a spiritual life for these kids. They Absolutely. It's playing out in a way that comes out as fear. Like, what can someone say to the people like your parents or anyone of any age that is in this fear? What is the pastoral care in a nutshell?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with recognizing changing context. And I say that with some degree of hesitation because I don't believe that there was a golden age. I'm not a fan of the good old days. I don't think they ever existed. I suspect that there isn't a generation that hasn't had these same fears. And I think that when we put the past on a pedestal of some sort, that's having the wrong vision. That's blinders. We're not actually seeing the past generations for what they were. And so I don't want to say that it was just better back in the 50s or whatever when everybody had to be at church on Sunday. There's actually something perhaps even more exciting for the church in recognizing that. And again, this is speaking more from a very southern context. I have to admit, I'm not sure that the rest of the country has the same sort of dynamics socially. But in a culture where up until the last 15 or 20 years, in this particular area, the question is never, do you go to church, but which church do you go to? Right. I
Yes.
mean, that's the cultural question for the communities that I live in the South. It's never a question of do you go to church. It's so where do you go? You know, do you go to First Baptist? Do you go to downtown Lutheran, or are you Methodist or whatever? But it's always a where do you go? And that presumption, I think, is just starting to not make sense in our culture anymore. That there's just starting to be a sense in which one can't just make those assumptions anymore, and that's unnerving for people. But I also think it's a time for the church to really grow. It's a time for the Spirit to really be active and moving, because what it means is now for us to be actively engaged in ministry is a choice, not just a default mode. You know, I don't just...
And that, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
It feeds really well into Rod asking, how do we deal with other cultural pulls on youth? You know, there's athletics, and
Right.
you know, there in Minnesota, it's hockey games on Sunday morning.
Right.
You know, that is a more nationwide issue, I would say.
Right.
So, you know, how are you dealing with those cultural pulls on what used to be the traditional church times?
Well, that's a great question, and I think a lot of that comes with being more flexible and thinking of what it means to do ministry and where and when that happens. You know, the 11 o'clock hour on Sunday morning does not have to be sacrosanct.
Right.
One can do ministry in any number of times and places, and it's not a matter of not doing ministry. It's a question of rethinking what that looks like within the cultural context that you find yourself. Down here, it's not hockey, it's soccer. But you know, whether it's Saturday morning soccer or Sunday morning hockey, or whatever the cultural pull is, or just students that have to work. I mean, students who are working full, even 20, 30 hours a week jobs. You know, those are the very real issues that we have. But those are just practical concerns. Those aren't things that keep us from doing ministry. They can become really good excuses for not doing ministry, but in and of themselves, they don't stop it.
I found I do ministry in New York City and Manhattan, and I found that this almost became a good thing that the kids had lots of other things to do, because they would only show up at church not for entertaining things but for meaningful things.
Right.
If they're supposed to teach Sunday school, they're there. If they're just doing a fun youth activity, they didn't show up.
Right.
It had to matter.
Right, absolutely, because then it does, and I mean, I think that's what we often sell our kids short. Children and youth,
Yes.
very much care about doing things that matter. About knowing that their presence matters, about actually doing ministry. This is why the model of moving towards equipping, I think, is helpful of thinking about that youth want to be equipped to do ministry. They don't want to simply be recipients. They
Right,
want
and Wendy said, oh, sorry. People are so wise, and you are too, and I'm trying to balance them. Thank you. So Wendy, just in building on what you're saying, the presence of children and youth are often perceived as an outward sign of the health of the community, like frogs in an ecosystem. I love it.
Right, absolutely.
And then Allison, so that really builds on what you're saying. And then Allison said, what you, Mindy, are saying is reminding her of the accompaniment model of mission, being present to our actual communities and walking alongside together based on realities we are facing together. Thank you, Allison and Wendy.
Right. Absolutely. And that may mean letting go of traditional model, or shifting gears, right? Not letting go completely, but shifting gears. There are alternative ways to engage youth. It does not have to be Sunday night youth group. There are all sorts of other activities ways that you can think about framing it. There's other times that you can meet, but it's largely a matter of getting kids, and not just kids, but kids, adults together, getting an entire community of faith thinking about what it means to be actively engaged in doing ministry and in being Spirit-formed people and being a community. One of the things to think about, I think, is, so in Micah, the prophet Micah I'm sure everybody's familiar with this passage, but God, has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? Well, I think that's exactly what it is we want to be focusing on for our youth and for our children. How do we help form a community? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Great. And when Callie is just wondering, you say, let's be open to other activities.
Right.
She's wondering what are some examples of other activities.
Okay. Gosh, I mean, you're really only limited by your own imagination. I mean, if you think...
Love it.
Your own imagination and the imaginations of your youth, actually. I mean, ask your kids, what do they care? What are they passionate about? Are they passionate about the fact that there are homeless people in your community? Are they passionate? You know, children are often passionate about the conditions of other children. So, so do you have children in your community for whom, you know, food there's a food scarcity, right? You have children, so anything. But I think thinking in the terms of Micah, what does it look like to do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly, but particularly focusing on doing justice and loving kindness? You know, children can do these things. What kinds of ways can we engage children and youth in doing justice in our communities? And there's not a simple answer to that. But there's an unlimited number of possibilities.
Right, of how to do that.
Of how to do it. And those are very context dependent, especially the justice one, but loving kindness maybe is less, but it's still very context dependent. You know, helping with homeless shelters, helping with the animal shelter, helping with backpack groups, getting involved in Habitat for Humanity, doing different the walk runs, different kinds of walks and runs that different communities have to raise money for good causes that might be dear to the hearts of people in your community. I'm not so sure that it matters what we do as much as it matters that we're doing. There's so many things. There's no way to do it all. There's no way to respond to every need. We simply can't. But if we're responding to the needs that are most pulling at our heartstrings, that are most pulling, most present around us, the faces that we can't not see, and find out what your children and youth are most passionate about, and what are the things that bullying. I mean, the children, bullying is such a huge area. What can we do in our communities to help make our schools a safer place? As much as this is a terrible problem, but to recognize it, you know, child abuse and child sexual abuse it's unbelievably endemic in parts of our country right now. The most recent statistic I've heard is that 1 in 10 of our children are sexually abused by a parent or caregiver before their 18th birthday.
Wow.
What can we do as communities of faith that help? I mean, that's a huge justice issue. What can we do to help protect and equip our children and youth to help protect one another and to draw good boundaries and to be aware of those things? So one of the ways that I've thought of to help us think through these things is actually to look at our affirmation of baptism. I mean, we make certain promises when we're baptized, and this actually comes from the affirmation of baptism. So rather than from the baptism itself, because it's worded slightly differently. But as a baptized member of God, of the community of God, these are the promises we've made: that we will live among God's faithful people, hear the word of God and share in the Lord's Supper, proclaim the good news of God in Christ through word and deed, and serve all people following the example of Jesus, and strive for justice and peace in all the earth. That's enough to keep us busy for a lifetime.
Right, that's enough.
That's I mean, I'm still working on Matthew 5. I mean, this is enough to keep us busy for a lifetime. And so I think that one way that we can think about framing the vision for ministry is to think about how do we help our communities, our children, our youth, ourselves individually because as we grow individually, we will also grow as a community. And as we grow as a community, we'll also all be growing individually. And so how do we continue to grow in love? One way of thinking about that is looking at this affirmation of baptism that we have and asking questions about, so the listener who asked specific activities, what can you do? Well, one way to think about it is to think, for example, take each one of these on their own. Hearing the Word of God and sharing in the Lord's Supper. How seriously do we take that? Do we encourage our youth to actually be active in church? I will confess up front at this point that I'm not a fan of children's church if it means children are just being excused from worship so that they're not hearing the sermon. There are ways to do children's church well so that they're being taught. But if it's just to get them out of the way so that adults don't have to hear them during a sermon, then I think we're failing to help them hear the Word of God and share in the Lord's Supper. Are we including them at every stage and age as is appropriate for who they are and where they are? What are the different ways that we might do that for different ages? And so the last slide that I have gives you kind of a way of thinking about that in a way that you might be able to then, as a community, answer that question of, so what does this look like? Because you could think through ways of how different stages, different ages, and you could change the categories, whatever fits your particular context. I was thinking in kind of a school sort of a format and putting it on here, but whatever however your community is configured, you could change the categories you have. Right. But think about, an upper elementary school kid, so that's, a 9, 10, 11-year-old child. So if you've got a group of 4th and 5th graders, and you wanted to focus on what does doing ministry with your upper elementary school kids look like, one thing you might do is kind of take that group of kids and put faces on it, names and faces. Give in my case, I'm going to see this little girl Lainey, and I'm going to say, okay, she's 10 years old, and what are the ways that I can help her to be equipped to do ministry by thinking through each of these categories? How do I engage her in living among God's faithful people? How do I engage her in hearing the Word of God and sharing in the Lord's Supper? How do I engage and kind of go in proclaiming the gospel and serving people, and all of those categories? You can just kind of walk through them, and it would be a great activity to do as a leadership group if you have other youth people that are working together, if you have a pastor that's involved in helping think through these things with you, to think through how each age group, and it doesn't have to be by age, it could be whatever demographic category makes sense for you, but how each group I would actually suggest you think through how they already are doing these things and then see where your gaps are.
Wonderful. And if you are listening to this broadcast later, we'll have a link to this handout right here by the video. And if you're listening live, it should be there in the next 24 to 48 hours. So okay. You can get it on paper if you'd like.
Great, thank you. So are there any more questions at this point?
Not right now, so keep going. We're doing really well. Okay,
great. And so thinking through, so let's keep going with our upper elementary school child then. I mean, maybe you think of, let's get down to serving all people, following the example of Jesus. And I think a very thoughtful conversation about what is it a 9-year-old child can do that would be a way of developing service skills, putting them into action.
Right.
And again, the possibilities are actually not literally endless, but they're really limited mostly by our imagination. And they can work alongside adults doing any number of things. I'm sorry, it sounded like you were...
No, we're good.
Okay.
We're good.
And so, sorry, I can't tell if you were trying to ask me a question or...
I apologize.
No, that's fine. And so, thinking through the particular activities could be serving in a soup kitchen, could be helping serve meals within the congregation. How do they participate in worship, right? Do they have a role? At what age? Do we have an age where we, So when you're 8, you suddenly can acolyte. Well, what about when you're 10? Can you then be a lay reader? Or what about the 9-year-old who reads really, really well and would like to participate in being a lay
There's
reader?
always one of those.
There's always that one, right?
Right, right.
And finding the ways that we can encourage these things so that children not only feel like they're an important part of the community, but actually are, so that when they're not there, they really are missed. Not just because we want the numbers, but because the ministry that child does matters, and we need her or him to be there because they know that what they do actually is making a difference in our community, in our families, in our congregations, in the world that they live in.
Wonderful. And that's going to, I mean, your example of the 9-year-old who reads well, they're just, as with anything, you just need to be aware of the gifts of each person, not unlike adults, and put them in the right place.
Right, absolutely.
Wonderful. So people can fill this out with their youth committee or whoever is really invested in ministry, right?
Right, absolutely. And try to just think of, I mean, I think just being creative is where the fun is. I mean, think for a minute how much fun it could be to talk with a group of, let's even go down below 9-year-olds, and let's think about the 6- and 7-year-olds. What does justice and peace look like for a 6-year-old? Mm-hmm. And what are the ways that we can help raise 6-year-olds to be peacemakers? I mean, blessed are the peacemakers. How do we help a 6-year-old learn what it means to be a peacemaker? What are the activities that we can engage them in our own communities that help them both witness what being a peacemaker looks like so that they have something to model on and then even to practice? And it can be on a larger political scale, or it can be on a very, very small scale of working with their neighbor, helping the smaller children play well together.
Right. I also think about children's relationships to animals sometimes can be teachable moments because they just have a sense, not all kids, a lot of kids have a sense of how to be gentle with a small thing, a small living being, and then how that can translate to people.
Right, absolutely.
Wonderful. Well, let's keep moving. We're getting little pictures of cats there.
Oh,
Do you, if people want to really read up on how to kind of move from vision to action, this is great. Listen to the webinar, as all of our listeners are. Are there like books or favorite resources or websites that you might recommend?
Any book by Andy Root or Kenda Creasy-Dean, I would recommend. Okay. Those would be my first two absolute jump out at me answer to that question. It's Andy Root and Kenda Dean are awesome.
Great. And what if I'm a volunteer youth leader and I'm going to the youth committee this coming Monday and I want to talk about some of the ideas here? Like, what's the process maybe in 3 steps? Like, start with those 4 types, maybe the Bible verse, maybe get to this worksheet. Like, what's kind of the process for the group of volunteers who's passionate about this?
Well, I think that if you can get the group, if you can get everybody on board with a vision of ministry that is not based on numbers, but on a faithful striving to live out our baptismal promises, that would be the first step. How do we go about thinking in terms of the promises made in baptism rather than numbers of heads that participate in any given activity? And that seems simple, but it's actually hard. I mean, I think that I think actually is where it all hangs, is on whether or not we can do that, whether or not we can get a focus that shifts to what does it look like to live faithfully in this community at this time and in this place. And that, unfortunately, we live in a world that quantifies things. We want everything to be quantified. And you can't quantify faith formation. It's not something we can put numbers on. There's no test. You can't standardize test this to see which of your children have passed certain levels and should they be promoted to the next grade because their faith has been formed to this level. So there's no way to quantify that, which means we often don't know what to do with that. And so I think this vision then of what it looks like is every age at an age-appropriate, developmentally appropriate level living out the promises of their baptism. And that's going to look different for everybody. And it's certainly going to look different for a 3-year-old than it looks for a 13-year-old. But the promises are the same, right? I mean, that's
right.
The promises are the same. It doesn't matter how old you are. The promises are actually the same. We haven't promised to do something that we're not enabled to do. God does enable us to do the things that we've promised in baptism to do. That's the gifts given, and we're given the gifts of the Spirit in baptism so that we might live out these promises.
Wonderful. You're getting some backup for Andy Root as a writer. Ken Casey Dean is also wonderful. But there's a new Bonhoeffer as Youth Worker by Andy Root.
Absolutely,
if there are people who are unfamiliar, it's just R-O-O-T, the traditional spelling of root, if you want to look up that book. And just backing up to you saying, there's no perfect ways and we're not quantifying. It's okay to not fill out every box on this workship either.
Absolutely. Right.
Groups can do what they can,
right,
and figure out what's working and fill in a different box next year, whatever's working.
And that sort of framework of having the boxes to fill out may not even work for everybody at all. I think that way. I think in categories. I think in a kind of linear organizational chart, sort of a way of thinking.
Wonderful.
That's my way of organizing material.
I'm sorry I'm losing you, and maybe Chris, our background person, you can tell me if I've interrupted or what's happening, but do you have any final thoughts? We're headed toward the end of our time, Mindy, and I want to make sure that you get the last word before there are any announcements.
Well, thank you very much. The final thought I would want to leave you with is the idea of right vision, of just learning to see our children and youth as gifts. As gifted.
Yes, as gifted. That's the great jump, isn't it?
Yes.
Well, thank you for your time. I love this topic. Thank you so much for presenting on it.
Thank you very much.
Good. So just a couple quick reminders before we all sign off. This webinar, along with all the others in the series, is being recorded and will be archived on the Practice Discipleship website at practicediscipleship.org. Please feel free to download it and use it with other members of your congregation. This really is your resource. Anyone can view it that you introduce. So, volunteers, church council members, adult forum colleagues, everyone who needs it. The link to the chart will be both under the YouTube video of this presentation and also on the Facebook page, Practice Discipleship. You can download Practice Discipleship site videos that I just mentioned and curriculum from previous years to use in your congregations and networks, also from that same site, so it's quite a resource. Each synod in the ELCA has a Practice Discipleship coach who's been trained to offer seminars on these webinars locally in your own synod. Training events are posted on the website, so please do keep checking back for updates. You can also find event dates on the network app for both iPhone and Android. The free app gives you anytime access to videos, news, and calendar of events, as well as an interactive prayer wall. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. I mentioned the Facebook page. If you put into the search on Facebook, Practice Discipleship Initiative, our Twitter handle is ELCAPD. You can join the network on October 21st for the Third Tuesday Conversation with Peter Ide, who will be speaking on family worship. And also an invitation. You're invited to the 2015 Extravaganza in Detroit. The Extravaganza is the annual gathering for adult leaders in children, youth, and family ministry with speakers, workshops, music, networking, and renewal. So this year's theme is story, and the writers for the 2015 Practice Discipleship curriculum will be presenting their sessions during the workshop. You can find out more at elcaymnet.org/EDC. 2015. Our next webinar is Thursday, November 13th, 1 p.m. Central Time. The title is Framing the Path, Practicing New Things with Rosella White. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you in November. Goodbye.